Well, let's start off with something that I'm going to excerpt and put out as just a little short video.
Okay.
This will be to throw some red meat to the Yang Gang. You you write quite a bit about and reference, pardon me, Thomas Paine,
Right.
one of the lesser known so-called founding fathers, or
Well,
intellectual
let's say,
founders.
can I just say lesser known in
Hmm.
the sense that he's not on the National Mall with a monument, but as we can talk about it in a little while, if you'd like, in every generation, every progressive movement in American history, when it reached back to lay claim to the revolution, grabbed hold of Thomas Paine and made him one of their sort of historical figures, their champions, every single one. I did this book, Thomas Paine of the Promise of America, which details all of that, to my surprise, because I thought too that he was generally suppressed as a figure in memory.
Well, I've been excited about the candidacy of Andrew Yang. I'm
Sure.
not I'm not a huge fan of universal basic income, but
Hmm.
he's the only candidate who seems to be speaking with any sort of knowledge and authority about the technological transformation that's taking place under our feet right now and the effects
Yeah.
that it has on people's ability to make a life, a living.
Hmm.
Um, in arguing for the universal basic income, though, he often references Thomas Paine. But as I understand Thomas Paine's proposal, it wasn't really so much a recurring income as a sort of like an inheritance from the state that you got.
Okay, well, actually, it's. You want me to explain what Paine
Yes,
had to
please.
say?
Hmm.
Yeah, and I'll just preface it by saying that I received a number of calls from the media, including PolitiFact, asking me to was the Yang Gang, was Andrew Yang on target in saying that his argument for universal basic income was grounded in Thomas Paine's work, and I said that one could imagine why they thought that, but there is a difference. So Paine did not argue for a universal basic income. He didn't argue for an annual payment by the state, not at all. What it is that Paine believed, I mean, he was a deist, not an atheist. He believed that God had created the universe, and essentially what he said is he created the earth for all to enjoy. But, but basically, as he well recognized and everyone recognized, there were gross inequalities in property holding. There were those who would become large, landed, rich. This was true, especially in Europe, but equally so in good parts of the United States. So his argument was that those folks who had those property holdings owed everyone else a tax. And that tax that they would pay would go into some kind of national fund or a community trust, or if you like, a national treasury. But it would be a special fund. And out of that fund, there would be two kinds of payments made. Paine's commitment was to end poverty. Okay, that was the fundamental. So he said, first of all, it should be the case that this fund affords what we would think of today as old age pensions or social security to men and women reaching the age of maturity, and I don't remember if it was 55 in common sense or 60, but the point was at the age of maturity, there would be a payment made to those folks to fight poverty. But the second thing is that if you're going to fight poverty, you should fight it early on, okay? And so he argued that out of this fund, every boy and girl, and by the way, that was a rather feminist position to take. It wasn't just young men. Every boy and girl on reaching the age of maturity should be granted a stake, stake, a sum of money to enable them, okay, to either set up a business, secure some kind of education, secure land for themselves. This, he said, would afford a real sense of, he didn't use the word opportunity, I don't believe, but basically it's a sense that they had a propulsion of an economic sort to their lives. So when Andrew Yang argues for universal basic income, one can imagine how he could see it rooted in Thomas Paine's thinking, but Paine did not argue for an annual payment to all citizens. Does that get to the question?
Well, that's definitely a good start, and I guess the follow up, and this will be the red meat for the Yang Gang, is what's your opinion on the Freedom Dividend proposal?
I don't favor universal basic income. In part, it's a practical thing, and it's the fact that I believe work is an expression of our humanity, but the ways in which we're compelled to work is often a denial of that humanity. And so what I would say is that, are we so uncreative as a species that we cannot imagine, even with the changes in technology, that other kinds of human activity, which we might or might not want to call work, would not be made available? I mean, I would argue that there ought to be a greater redistribution of income. I'm decidedly in favor of a democratic socialist project. The idea of an annual payment, here's my fear about that universal basic income, that it will be seen, I should add one other thing, that Paine said that everyone would receive the old age pension and everyone would receive the original payment to young people. That there was, in that sense, it's not unlike Andrew Yang's perhaps universal basic income. But the thing is that they had to accept it. They could give it back, but they had to accept it because he did not want either the old age pensions or the young people's grants to be seen in any fashion as a charity. And that's essential. Now, to the extent the universal basic income might actually be just that, okay, not a charity, that it would be truly a universal, that's a good idea. But it's also the case that in the context of this corporate capitalist order, to give people an annual payment might well just lead to higher rents on poor people or any number of other raises in costs for the poor and working poor. So I don't see that as a way of addressing the gross inequalities and truly the kind of poverty that persists in this country. I just don't. And so as a consequence, I don't see that in any sense as an immediate project. That's probably what it is, okay?
I think for a lot of people, particularly young people who are facing a difficult economic landscape, a difficult sort of career pathway, they probably agree with you in broad strokes about, with all of our ingenuity and new technology, we surely should be able to find some way to create employment for people. But the idea of getting $1,000 just deposited to your bank account every month is very easy to imagine. Whereas a lot of, say, Bernie Sanders proposals, which clearly are aimed at advantaging, working people,
right?
It's difficult to see, to trace the path of policy implementation to things get better for me. Whereas $1,000 in my bank account next month, that requires no imagination whatsoever. I mean, I understand immediately.
Yeah, that's a fair practical observation. Camo, that's decidedly a fair practical observation. But here's the thing, okay? And that's why I brought out with Zero Books this volume, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. Hold it up a little higher.
There we go.
Thank you. The thing that people, the problem is that we have literally been compelled or led to forget what we are capable of achieving. And the fact is that during the 1930s New Deal, for all of the faults and failures of those years, it really was very much a sort of radical, almost revolutionary experience in which we innovated with Social Security, we empowered workers with the National Labor Relations Act, we extended electric power to hundreds of thousands of farms that just had no electricity. We created a civilian conservation corps and addressed the environment, fought soil erosion, combated any repeat of the Dust Bowl, built hydroelectric dams in order to basically enable regions of the country without electricity to have them. I mean, on and on and on. And so what we forget is what we've achieved basically through public initiative. And by way of an election in 1932 that sent to Washington Roosevelt and the Democrats, the New Dealers, you might say, and the degree to which in 34, Congress actually became all the more dominated by Democrats. In 1936, once again, Roosevelt actually won by an unprecedented landslide in 36. So if we think about today, Bernie's things may seem to upper middle class people, okay, not necessarily advantaging them, okay. It may also seem like, how the hell is he going to secure that kind of legislation in the kind of divisive Congress that we have? But the point is that you mobilize, you elect, and you make sure that the mobilization is not simply turning out in the streets, but also seriously empowering working people, that a whole series of initiatives take place. So, whether or not people fully grasp it, we should remind ourselves that Social Security was argued to be an impossibility, and if not an impossibility, some kind of communist plot. Now, Medicare for all, which exists in any number of, in all the rest of the Western democratic countries, and we have yet to install it, I can tell you that ever since the 1930s, the majority of Americans have wanted it. So the question is not whether or not it's feasible and people want it, it's fully the case of whether or not we're able to confront the powers that be who are so eager and have been for so many decades willing to suppress that aspiration. So I think it's not simply a matter of policy and program, it's also a matter of politics.